Hello fellow crafters, I'm Karen, and this is part 2 of our 1920s dress tutorial. In this video, I'll be showing you how to make the sleeveless bodice. Welcome back to our 1920s dressmaking process. I hope you're enjoying wandering through the unknowns of doing this without a pattern. In part 1, we made a lovely rectangle turn into what looks like a skirt, and in this part we're going to be making the bodice. You'll see here that the materials and tools overlap a lot with part 1. We're going to be returning to our fabric to cut out our bodice pieces, so we'll need our cutting tools and our fabric. And of course we'll be sewing again, so you'll need your pins and your sewing equipment, as well as an iron to press your fabric. There is one element that we will need for the bodice that we did not need for the skirt, and that is that I got some of this, what I would call maybe embellishing ribbon, and I picked this out because I thought that it would bend well around a curved neckline. So we're going to be hand sewing that on, so you'll need your matching thread. And I thought that it would just add a little bit of decoration, but also hide any tricky stitching that goes on in the neckline. I wanted to add a step here to go through the measurements and calculations that I did to figure out how to make the bodice. Now remember, since we're not using a pattern, I'm approaching this very mathematically. So looked at it as a math problem and said, how do I make this work? And I also used a tank top that I already had to get some of the measurements of like the neckline and the armholes so that I would have basically a template to start with. So I'm going to walk you through the reasoning that I did and how you can get those measurements from a piece of clothing that you already have and from the final measurements of the skirt. The bodice is going to be made out of 2 panels, a front one and a back one, that are almost identical with the exception of the way I'm going to cut the neckline. So the first thing I needed to figure out was how wide to make the panels. And this is based solely on the skirt opening, so the top of the skirt has a certain measurement, whatever you ended up with from the end of part 1, and we're just going to divide that in 2, so we get half for the front and half for the back. Some, like fancier clothing, will have different panel lengths for the front and the back, usually longer in the front and smaller in the back. I'm not going to mess with that, I'm just going to let the seams end up where they end up so that it's simpler. The second measurement that we're going to need is the height of the bodice, which is actually going to be the sum of 2 parts. You've got the skirt to the bottom of the armhole, and then you've got the bottom of the armhole to the shoulder. So that first measurement I labeled B here, and that is just a measurement that I took from where the skirt top will be, so at roughly the center of the hip, up to sort of where it felt comfortable for the bottom of the armhole to be. And then the other measurement I actually got from the tank top that I measured. So when I was looking at it, I wear a size medium, and it had from shoulder to the bottom of the armhole was about 7 inches in the opening. It's a little bit tricky because the fabric is flexible, but I just tried to sort of lay it flat on the table and get a good measurement, and it was about 7 inches. Those measurements are the nice and easy ones. Now it gets slightly more complicated, but I pulled a lot of these numbers from the tank top that I measured to make it easier. So the next thing that I measured was what I have as D here, and letter D represents the width of the neck hole. So this was just a straight measurement of the tank top lying on the table. I got about 9 inches. So just make note of that. And then the second measurement you'll need here, which is letter E, is the width of the armhole. And again, this is with your tank top laying flat on a table. So it's just the opposite measurement of your letter C, and we're just measuring from the edge of the shoulder out to the edge of the side seam on the tank top. Once you have those 2 numbers, we're going to be able to calculate how wide we need to make those shoulder straps to make up for the rest of the fabric that we have. So this one's going to be a fun little math problem. We're going to take our measurement A, which is the total width of our bodice. We're going to do some subtraction. So we need to subtract 2 times our armhole width. So whatever your letter E was, subtract that twice from your letter A. And then we're going to subtract our neck hole width, which you only have to do once because we measured the whole hole. And then you're going to be left with the total of both shoulder straps. So whatever that number is, divide it by 2, and that's going to be the width of 1 shoulder strap. And once you have all of these numbers, that's really all of the dimensions that you need for your bodice. The only other thing that you'll probably want to measure is the distance from the shoulder to the bottom of the neckline so you can measure the curve. But if you trace it, or if you just want to sort of guess at that later, that's fine, because there's no specific need to have that measurement. It's just how you want it to look. The only difference that I had to do for the back instead of the front is that I had to just decide how deep I wanted the V to be, because I'm doing a V cut in the back as opposed to a rounded cut in the front. So I just decided that I wanted that at about 6 inches. So instead of the one neckline on the front, we'll just do a V in the back. Now remember, these are our final dimensions. So if you were to cut your fabric like this, you would end up with a bodice that's too small. We need to add a little bit for seams, and this is where it starts getting a little hairy. So I decided that my outer dimensions, so the side seams, the shoulder seams, and where the bodice attaches to the skirt, those are all going to have a 1-inch seam allowance. So it'll be a 1/2 inch hem when we're done. So I took my outer dimensions of the bodice, so I'm kind of ignoring the neck hole and the armholes, and I just was looking at it as a rectangle. So I've got my A width and my B plus C height, and then I'm adding 1 inch on all sides. So whatever your width is, you're going to add a total of 2 inches. Whatever your height is, you're going to add a total of 2 inches, and that will give you the rectangle that you need to cut twice, because one's for the front, one's for the back. And I'm going to be doing those stacked so that I just only have to cut that once. After that, we're going to fold that in half, and with it folded, we're going to cut the neckline. I often work, just in general on crafts, from the center out, because then you can make sure that the center is where it needs to be, because it's really bad if it's off center when you need it to be center. And I'm leaving for all of the holes, so the neck hole, the 2 armholes, I'm doing only a 1/2 inch seam allowance there, which will result in 1/4 inch hems. I'm just doing this so I deal with less puckering in the fabric. I haven't worked out exactly how I'm going to do all of that, but I don't want to mess with it too much. So smaller seam allowance there. So we'll cut the neck hole. In the back it'll be a triangle, in the front it'll be kind of a U shape. And then we'll do basically the same process but with the armholes instead, leaving a 1/2 inch. So I think with all of this in mind, I'm going to go ahead and cut my rectangles, cut out the neck holes, and cut out the armholes, and then we'll check back in for the next step. That had some trials to it, but I have my finished pieces cut out for the front and the back, and they look right and they line up when I stack them. So that's all I needed out of this step. I think that the steps from here on out are going to get a little bit easier because we've already done the thinking, we've already done the planning, we've already done the cutting, so we just have to line stuff up and sew it together. So we're going to start with the shoulders, and remember we left a 1-inch seam allowance, so what we're going to do is pin that together. I have to figure out what I'm going to do in the back because it's angled. I might just cut it. I haven't quite worked that out, but we'll pin them together. Sew across where we've pinned at that 1-inch line so it has a seam at 1 inch, and then we will fold those edges in to make a hem. So we'll just do a hem. It will stick out from the fabric on the inside, so it will just like fold either way. we will fold it backwards when we sew in the armholes and the neck hole. So the only thing that you would want to think about at this point is if you have right sides of your fabric, so what needs to be the outside, you want to put right sides together so that our seams and hems end up on the inside. That went very smoothly, and you can see now that we have shoulders that are attached. The seams look nice and neat on the outside as well as on the inside, so I'm quite happy with how that turned out. And we get to move on to the next step. For this step, we need to sew up the sides, and for this, I'm going to use exactly the same method that I just did on the shoulders. So we'll put the outsides of the cloth together, and then we will mark that 1-inch line up the edges and pin the fabric so it won't move. Then we'll sew up that line, fold the edges in again to hem, and I used an iron last time, which I will do again this time because it really does help to hold the piece in place. And then we'll sew just an extra seam to hold those hems in place, and then we'll be done with the sides. If I'm quite honest with you, we're heading into what will probably be the least professional part of this, and that's going to be hemming the arm and neck holes. And the reason it's going to be the least professional is that it's not going to be a perfect finished edge on the inside. What I'm planning on doing, and this is why I aimed for sort of more straight edges to the neckline and armholes as opposed to more circular, what I'm going to be doing is hemming them in, so we have the 1/2-inch allowance, and when I get to a corner I'm going to have to make some cuts so that the fabric doesn't pucker when we try to make the turn. And with some of the other pieces of clothing that I was looking at to get ideas for how this would work, they often have like another strip of fabric on the inside so that you get this nice happy little double edge on the top, but I'm not going to take the time to do that because this is a costume. So I'm just going to be folding them in, folding my hem back underneath like I would anywhere else, and just running with whatever it looks like on the inside. So we'll get this pinned and cut as needed, and then go ahead and sew around the neckline and both armholes. I've finished hemming the neck hole and the armholes, so those are complete, and they look pretty good. I was actually kind of surprised that they turned out as well as they did. I did have to iron the neckline to make it look a little bit neater, and I still have to do that with the armholes, but the only real issue that I had was just on the back, and I had this one spot where I wasn't quite catching the underside of the hem with my thread. So that one's folded a little bit where it doesn't belong. So I'm aiming, since I'm going to put on the embellishment next, to just catch that and fold it back under with some of those threads, and then you wouldn't notice it at all. If I weren't adding the embellishment, I would probably just iron it so it lays flat and call it a day. So on to the next step. The final step for the bodice is to attach our ribbon to the neckline. So I'm going to find basically the center point of the ribbon and the center point of the neckline and start there and just work my way around the outside of the neckline. I haven't decided yet if it's going to stick out a little bit over the edge or if it's going to stay within the edge. I'm still on the fence about that, but I will probably roughly pin it on and then sew around by hand. This is all going to have to be done by hand, so I have my thread for that. And then when I get to the back, when I hit that V, my ribbon is going to pass the V, and I haven't figured out exactly how far I want it to go, but I'll go a little bit, probably not super far because my fingers will be tired, and I'll cut the ends and make sure that they are secured nicely, and then the bodice will be all done. It took me about 3 hours and 45 minutes to hand sew on the embellishment here, but it does look pretty good. It's not perfect, of course, but it lies well. So this is what it looks like from the front, and then the back as well. I chose to go just maybe 2 inches down the, further down the embellishment before I cut it. And I may have to do something to finish these off at some point, a little glue maybe, so that they don't unravel, but it is tied nice and securely in place with my thread, so I think that we're in good shape there. So this brings us to the close of part 2, so you can join me in part 3 as we go ahead and attach the bodice to the skirt. Thanks for supporting Tickled Fancy Crafting by watching this video. This content is available on YouTube and Rumble, so click the like or Rumble button to let me know that you enjoyed the content, and subscribe to see new Tickled Fancy Crafting videos in your feed. If you'd like to be informed directly about the content, ring the notification bell on YouTube or adjust your notification settings on Rumble. Comment with crafts that you would like to see in the future, and remember, you can make this.